Sarkozi Gyorgy. Born January 22, 1899 in Budapest, died March 8, 1945 in Balv. Poet, novelist. Descendant of lower middle class family. Completed schooling in Vac and Budapest. Poems first appeared in 1917 in Nyugat, and he became one of most capable pupils of Mihaly Babits, QB, and formed friendships with Lorink Szabo and Laszlo Németh, QQB. Studied law at University of Budapest for 6 months in 1918, then became student at Zenacademia for short time in 1919, after which he studied philosophy. Became literary advisor to Athenaeum Publishing House in 1919. Helped to edit Pandora in 1927. Married Marta Molnar, daughter of Ferenc Molnar, QB, in 1933. In 1930s turned attention increasingly to social problems, especially those of peasants. Edited Velez 1935 to 1938 and founded Magyarország Felfedzi series in 1936, which consisted of important sociographic studies by Ferenc Erdély, Gazafija, and Zoltán Szabo. One of the leaders of March Front in 1937. Prosecuted in 1938 for publishing summons of March Front in Velez. Worked for Kalatnit for a time in 1939 and then increasingly withdrew from public activity. Spent early months of 1944 in Martinhagy Sanatorium and then served in forced labor camp. Transported by Germans to Western Hungary, where he died of starvation. Important member of the so-called second generation of Nyugat lyric poets and of populist movement. His early poems were affected by Nyugat standards and Catholic ideals. Poems romantic in tone and strong in use of poetic techniques. Used free verse frequently. Later poems are concerned with social problems and become more realistic in tone and tighter in form. Translated some works of Barbacé, Goethe, Julian Green, Thomas Mann, and Moryuk. Some of his poems have been translated into English, French, German, Italian, Polish, and Romanian. Sandor. Born January 20, 1889 in Budapest, died September 28, 1963 in Budapest. Poet, translator, literary historian, religious writer. Completed schooling at Piarist Gymnasium in Budapest. Entered Piarist order in 1903. Obtained teaching certificate and doctorate in philosophy from Pázmány University in 1910. In 1910 taught briefly at Piarist Gymnasium in Vac, afterwards at the Order's Gymnasium in Budapest. Became a member of Kisfaludy Tarsasig and Petofi Tarsasig in 1923. Also a member of St. Istvan Academia. Was professor of modern Hungarian literature at University of Szeged 1930 to 1944. Opposed nationalism and fascism. Some of his plays were performed. Awarded Bajanac Medal by Hungarian Academy of Sciences for Istvan Kirali in 1938. President of Országos Köznebeli Tanács 1946 to 1947. Edited Vigilia from 1946 until his death. Awarded Kossuth Prize in 1948. Became head of Piarist order in Hungary in 1948. One of the most important religious lyric poets in 20th century Hungarian literature. Great influence on writers of Catholic literature. His poems are strongly humanistic and concerned with social problems. Seek to encourage humility, brotherhood, love, morality, and to reassure readers about the human state. Also an important literary historian and translator. His study of aesthetics still considered indispensable. Some of his writings have been translated into English, French, and German. Sinka Istvan. Born September 24, 1897 in Nagyszalonták, died June 1969 in Budapest. Poet, short story writer. Father a sheep herder. In early childhood worked selling mineral water, shining shoes, and herding sheep. Was servant to various landed families from age 16 to 35 and then became sharecropper. Entered literary life in 1934 as populist writer. Moved to Budapest in 1936, where he was unemployed for a long time. Turned increasingly nationalistic during World War II. Was silent for a long period after 1945 except for some writings published in Velez 1946 to 1947. Resumed publishing in 1961. Poems characterized by strong sympathy for poor people and intuitive feelings, sometimes shamanistic in mysticism. Critical of ruling classes. Ballads generally considered the best expression of his poetic character. Short stories deal with the life of peasants. Some of his poems have been translated into French, German, and Italian. Cinco Urban. Born October 5, 1898 in Apatin, died March 1967 in Zagreb, Yugoslavia. Novelist, short story writer, dramatist, essayist. Was librarian of Workers' Home in Sabatka while a student in the gymnasium. Left school for military service in 1916. Became member of Munkistanax in Budapest in fall 1918. In charge of Zobchitas and then commander of Kexkmet during period of revolutionary government. His writings appeared in Etate, Ma, and Internationale. Emigrated to Vienna in 1919, where he lived until 1926. Writings appeared in Magyar Újság, in Vienna, and in Tűz, in Pozsony. Edited and published Testver in 1924. Lived in Yugoslavia 1926 to 1932. Works appeared in Korinth, Nyugat, and Századunk during this period. Moved to Paris and then to Zurich, where he formed friendships with Mihaly Károlyi and Romain Rolland. Lived in Moscow 1935 to 1937 and in Paris 1937 to 1939, where his writings appeared in El Europe, Monde, and Ce Soir. Returned to Yugoslavia in 1939 and lived in Zagreb and then in Drvar. During World War II he withdrew to Dalmatia where he was captured and interned by the Italians. After Italy's capitulation he joined Liberating Army in area. In 1945 he returned to Zagreb, where his previously unpublished works are still appearing in Croatian translations. In 1946 he began to devote his energies to literary studies and writings on public affairs. Performed a major role in Hungarian literature and life in Yugoslavia. Named associate member of Yugoslavian Academy of Arts and Sciences in Zagreb in 1950, its regular member in 1960. Became professor and director of Hungarian department at Novi Sad University in 1959. His novels, short stories, and dramas are centered on revolutionary themes in creation of socialistic society. Writings characterized by strong analytical and intellectual bent. Wide interest in world literature reflected in literary studies and treatises. Some of his works are available only in Serbo-Croatian. Szabady Laszlo. Born May 7, 1907 in Saromperki, died April 19, 1959 in Kolosvar, Romania. Poet, literary historian, linguist. Family name, Székely. Descendant of impoverished aristocratic family. Studied Unitarian theology, linguistics, and literary history in Kolosvar and Strasbourg. Official in Arad, later dramaturge of Kolosvaries in Haz. From 1931 to 1938 was a staff member of Ellenzék, in which his poems were first published. Opposing the merger of Transylvania with Hungary in 1940, he withdrew from the public scene and became teacher in Bere, wrote, and collected Romanian folk songs. In 1945 became staff member of Világország, Kolozsvár. Helped to organize Athenaeum and to establish Hungarian Folk Federation in Szepes Gyorgy in 1945, served as its director until 1947. Was professor of aesthetics at Bolyai University in Kolozsvár from 1947 until his death by suicide. His poems are highly pessimistic, intellectual, and humanistic. Discouraged about future of man. Used traditional poetic forms. His literary and linguistic studies are important. An edition of his selected poems is available in Romanian, and some of his poems have been translated into German and Polish. Savo Deso. Born June 10, 1879 in Kolozsvár, Transylvania, died January 5, 1945 in Budapest. Novelist, short story writer, publicist, essayist. Descendant of family of lower gentry and small functionaries. Completed gymnasium studies at Reformatus Collegium in Kolozsvár. After failure of early efforts to gain admission to Jewish Collegium in Budapest, he worked for a year as a private tutor and in a law office. Admitted to Jewish Collegium and specialized in Hungarian and French. Pursued linguistics, published a study on this subject while he was still a university student. After obtaining teacher's diploma, he taught in Budapest for a year, spent 1905 to 1906 in Paris on a fellowship. Abandoned plans for career in linguistics and accepted teaching post in Székesfehérvár, where he began publicist writings. Because of his clericalism and anti-Semitism, he was forced to move from one teaching position to another under administrative surveillance. Taught in Nagyvárad in 1908, where he met Gyula Juhász, QV, became acquainted with newly developing principles in Hungarian lyric poetry, changed many of his views, and increasingly associated himself with progressive literary groups. Obtained permanent position in Székesfehérvár in 1909. Spent 2 summers in Paris prior to 1914. Participated in agitation for higher wages for teachers in 1910. Received national attention in 1911 through open letter to Istvan in Nyugat. From this time on he contributed regularly to Nyugat and later to Husadik Század, first as critic and publicist and then as belletristic author. He taught in Sumag, 1913, Unvar, 1914, and Laux, 1918, still under administrative surveillance. Went to Budapest during revolution in 1918. First welcomed establishment of revolutionary government but soon turned against it. His open opposition forced him to hide in the provinces until the fall of the revolutionary government, when he returned to Budapest. Became supporter of the new government. Established Magyar Iraq Szövetség and served as its president for a time. Abandoned teaching for literary career. Principal contributor to Ifjak Szava in 1919, writer of lead articles for Viradot 1920 to 1921, and contributor to NEP in 1921. In January 1923 took over Aurora, which soon changed title to Elit es Irodalom and ceased at end of year. Increased his opposition to Horthy government 1922 to 1923. Left Hungary in fall 1924 with intention of settling elsewhere, spent a few months in Italy and France, returned to Hungary in early part of 1925 first to Szeged, then to Budapest. Identified himself increasingly with anti-fascist movement and populist writers. Openly opposed Nazis and became pro-Russian. Died of illness and hunger during siege of Budapest. His writings on current affairs and novels wielded great influence on young intellectuals between 2 world wars. His aim was to reform Hungarian society. Strong didacticism found in his imaginative writings, style often volatile. Viewed inner qualities of peasant as basis on which Hungary could be preserved and developed as a nation. Az El Falu has been translated into Slovakian and Turkish, Xodolatos Elit into Italian, Sejicek into Czech, Italian, and Romanian, and some of his short stories into English, French, Italian, and Polish. C.S. Sabo Laszlo. Born May 29, 1905 in Rietsag. Essayist, short story writer, critic. Studied at Sorbonne. Obtained doctorate in economic history but soon turned to literary career. Became secretary to Antal Eber, president of Magyarolaz Bank and Kereskedel My ESI Parkamara, 1932 to 1935. Director of Literary Section of Magyar Radio 1935 to 1944, where he distinguished himself with broadcasts on Hungarian literature. In the meantime, he contributed to Nyugat and Magyar Szalag. Awarded Baumgarten Prize in 1936. Became Professor of Literature and Art History at Képzőművészeti Főiskola in 1945. Left Hungary in 1949 and lived in Florence until 1952 when he moved to England, where he is working in the Hungarian section of the British Broadcasting Corporation. Writer of poems, short stories, and essays. Has made major contribution to the development of the essay form in Hungary through broadening subject matter and highly cultivated literary style. In some writings he advocates unity between Hungarian and European culture. Some of his poems have been translated into French, German, and Italian. Sabo Lorenc. Born March 31, 1900 in Miskolc, died October 3, 1957 in Budapest. Poet, translator. Father a locomotive engineer. Attended gymnasium in Balasage Yarmouth and entered Reformed College in Debrecen, where he was already writing poetry. Drafted into military service in 1918 and passed examination for infantry officer. Fled from army in fall 1919 in Budapest and entered university. First pursued mechanical engineering and then philosophy but did not complete studies. Submitted poems to editors of Nyugat in November 1919. Mihaly Babic, QB, took notice of him and formed close friendship with him. Became staff member of AZ's publications in fall 1921 on recommendation of Lehos Mikes and Arpad Toth, QB. Married daughter of Lehos Mikes in 1923. Poems appeared mainly in Pesti Naplo and Uj Doc, not again in Nyugat until 1929. Left AZ's periodicals in 1926. The following year he became editor of Pandora, which he edited with Gyorgy Sarkozi, QV. When Pandora ceased in October 1927 he returned to staff of AZ's publications. Increased his journalistic activity and served as assistant editor of Magyarország in 1930. Awarded Baumgarten Prize in 1932, 1937, and 1944. Visited Germany, Dalmatia, and Egypt in 1930s. Principal contributor to AZ's publications beginning in 1936. Served as soldier when Upper Northern Hungary and Transylvania returned to Hungary in 1940. Was official delegate to Weimar Congress of European Writers in 1942. After World War II he was often forced to defend himself against charges of rightist views and activities. Writings appeared only in Velaz, for which he also edited Poetry Section 1946 to 1949. In 1950s he spent much time in Tehani translating. Awarded Kossuth Prize for Life Work in 1957. His poems show broad range of experimentation with forms and literary principles but are basically representative of the decadent school. Deeply concerned with struggle of individual in indifferent cosmos, expressing repugnance with what he finds in life around him. Strongly pessimistic in outlook, Prolific translator of Shakespeare, Coleridge, Omar Khayyam, Baudelaire, Molière, Verlaine, Villon, Goethe, Kleist, Turgenev, Pushkin, Mayakovsky, and I.A. Krylov. Some of his poems have been translated into English, French, German, Italian, Polish, and Slovakian. Savo Pal. Born April 5, 1893 in Biharagra. Descendant of a courtier family. Novelist, short story writer, dramatist. Completed only elementary school. Father's death placed burdens of family support on him at age 12. Became apprentice bricklayer, farmed, developed skills in construction work. Served on several fronts during World War I. Did not participate very actively in events of 1918 to 1919, but after the failure of the revolutionary government he was restricted to place of residence for 2 years. Engaged in political activities, married, and earned living through physical labor. At 37 began to write with intent to pursue a literary career. Discovered by Zsigmond Moraes, QV. Moved to Budapest. Helped to found Smallholders Party in early years of 1930s and served as its parliamentary representative at various times. His writings were published regularly. Published Komati es Videk with Istvan Sinka, QV, and Deans Barsi, and after it was banned, he founded Kalatnip in 1935, which he then turned over to Zsigmond Moraes. Edited Sabatzo 1938 to 1944. President of National Peasants' Party 1938 to 1944. Has served as its parliamentary representative since 1945. Awarded Baumgarten Prize, 1949, Attila Josep Prize for Writings after 1945, 1950, and Kossuth Prize for Fells of Agel Fold, a scenario, 1951, and for UJ Fold, a novel, 1954. President of National Council of Patriotic People's Front 1954 to 1956 and then a member of its Secretariat. Continues to write and to serve in Parliament to date. His novels and short stories present a realistic picture of unfortunate life of peasants. Populist in outlook. Dramas portray differences in views of agricultural workers and intellectuals. Emberek has been translated into Bulgarian and English, Ozavets, and Lakadalam, Kirestillo, Balkso into German, Isan Malma into Czech, German, and Slovakian, Tal Palatny Fold into Bulgarian, Chinese, Czech, German, and Slovakian, and some of his short stories into Bulgarian, English, German, Lithuanian, Polish, Russian, and Slovakian. C. Molnar Albert. Born August 30, 1574 in Zan, died January 17, 1634 in Kolosvar, Transylvania. Translator of Psalms, philologist, linguist. Name also spelled Zinchi. Son of a miller. Began schooling at age 10. Studied in Zan, year 1586, Gon 1587 to 1588, and Debrecen 1588 to 1590. Writing poems in Hungarian by 1588. Was tutored in Kassa for a few months and returned to Zan. On November 1, 1590, began study tour which took him to Wittenberg 1590 to 1592, Dresden, Heidelberg 1592 to 1593, and Strasbourg 1593 to 1595. Baccalaureate, Strasbourg, May 21, 1595. After tour of Switzerland and Italy in 1596 returned to Heidelberg to study theology for 4 years. Much influenced by humanists, historians, and philologists. Returned to Hungary in fall 1599, returned to Germany in February 1600 and studied theology and philology in Frankfurt 1600 to 1603, Altdorf 1603 to 1606, Marburg 1607 to 1611, and finally Oppenheim. Acquainted with Kepler in Prague. Prepared a Latin-Hungarian and Hungarian-Latin dictionary, 1604, his major work, a Hungarian translation of 150 Psalms of David, 1607, a new edition of the Bible, 1608, and a Hungarian grammar in Latin, 1610. Again tried to establish himself in Hungary 1612 to 1615. Entered service of Ferenc Bathyany. Became evangelical preacher in Rahan in 1613 and brought his family to Hungary. Minister in Komárom till fall 1614. Served at Gábor Bethlen's court in Transylvania in 1615. Returned to Germany in fall 1615 for 9 years, assistant teacher in Amberg for a short time, choirmaster in Oppenheim 1615 to 1619, resident of Heidelberg 1619 to 1622 and of Hanau 1622 to 1624. Published Hungarian translation of Calvin's Institutio in Hanau in 1624, and in that year returned to Kassa at Gábor Bethlen's invitation, via Amsterdam, England, Danzig, and Poland. Moved to Kolosvar about 1626. Visited Leva in July 1628 and Debrecen in 1633. Leading writer of Calvinistic literature. He translated numerous works. His works concern matters valued by the late humanistic culture of the Reformation. His Hungarian dictionary and grammar affected the development of the literary language. His translations of the Psalms mirror the poetry of songs prevailing during the Hungarian Reformation. His pedagogical, learned, and theological writings all reveal individual treatment and wide concern for the development of Hungary. Zinteliki Kornel. Born 1893 in Pécs, died August 20, 1933 in Osijek, Yugoslavia. Poet, short story writer. Family name, Stankovics. Descendant of Kisfalutis on mother's side. Family was living in Zombor by end of century. Studied at University of Budapest and obtained medical degree in 1916. Writings first appeared in a Het and then in Uj Doc. Moved to Yugoslavia after World War I and became physician in Gara and then in Osijek. Despite constant illness, he established and directed Hungarian literary activities in the area. First published the works of Yugoslavian Hungarian writers in Vajday Sajai Iras, Savodka, in 1928, and then in Kalanja, Ajayvidek, which he founded with Zoltán Ksuka in 1932 and edited himself. He made possible the regular publication of works by Hungarians in Yugoslavia. Because of his encouragement of literary activities in Bačka and Banat, he was given the name Kazincha, QV. Turned major attention to such organizational and promotional efforts in 1928 and wrote very little thereafter. His poems are concerned extensively with pain and longing for beauty. His descriptions of scenes and expressions of mood are considered to be the best aspects of his poetry. Noted for linguistic studies and translations. He was the first to interpret modern Yugoslavian poetry for Hungarians. Some of his poems have been translated into French. Szep Erno. Born June 30, 1884 in Hust, died October 2, 1953 in Budapest. Poet, novelist, short story writer, dramatist, journalist. Began schooling in Debrecen. Wrote poetry while still in school and published small volume of poetry in 1902, in Mazodor. Moved to Budapest and became a journalist when 19. Appearance of his poems and short stories in periodicals and dailies caught attention of public. He worked for AZ Est and then AZ Aj Sag. Spent life at journalistic and creative activity. Often considered to be the best representative of Impressionism and the decadent school in Hungarian literature. His lyric poems contain reflections on his youth. Short stories and novels deal with his life in Debrecen and that of ordinary men and artists in Budapest. Avoided contemporary problems, celebrating nostalgic longings for youthful purity and a better world. Excellent portrayal of everyday life in Budapest. Ezra and Mages have been translated into English, Bunim, Emberzig, and Lila Akok into German, Dolly Dolly Dal and October into Italian, and some of his poems into English, French, German, Hebrew, Italian, Japanese, Portuguese, and Romanian. Zerbantal. Born May 1, 1901 in Budapest, died January 27, 1945 in Balv. Essayist, literary historian, translator, novelist, short story writer. Completed university studies in Budapest and Graz. Specialized in Hungarian, German, and English, and obtained doctorate in 1924. Writings first published in 1921 in Nyugat under the name Antal Christoph Zerb. Visited Paris and Italy and spent 1929 to 1930 studying in London. Began teaching in Zekani Istvan Kereskital Mai Iskola in 1928. Became president of newly founded Magyar Irodalom Tudományi Társaság in 1933. Became privat docent at University of Zicst in 1937. Increasingly persecuted as fascism in Hungarian society developed, sought both refuge and protest in writings. Served in forced labor camps during World War II and died there after long period of illness and starvation. Wrote novels and short stories and developed the detective novel in Hungarian literature, but the essay was his major contribution. Strongly humanistic in outlook. His studies of Hungarian and world literature were significant and utilized method of history of ideas. His writings combined learning and artistic taste. Translated extensively from English, French, and Italian, including works of A. France, J. Huizinga, S. Mom, E. Knight, J. B. Priestley, R. B. Sheridan, P. G. Wodehouse, H. B. Van Loon, and H. Walpole. A Pendragon Legenda has been translated into Czech and English, Hetko's Napak Esk Sodak into German, and some of his short stories into English, French, Italian, and Portuguese. Ziglagetiata. Born March 8, 1814 in Nagyvarad, died January 19, 1878 in Budapest. Dramatist. Born Joseph Szatmári. Father a lawyer and member of landed gentry. Attended schools in Nagyvarad and Temesvar. Completed philosophy section of academy in Nagyvarad in 1832. Wanted to become physician, parents urged him to enter priesthood. Instead began engineering studies in Pest in 1834, soon decided to become an actor. In same year joined Varzin's theatrical company in Buda, which was directed by András Fay, QV, and Gabor Dobrante. He assumed new name at the command of his father, who disapproved of his theatrical career. Limited success as actor but wrote numerous plays. Contracted to write plays for National Theatre in 1837, when it opened. Became member of Academy in 1840. Won award for Rasa, the first of numerous prizes during his lifetime. Zakat Katona, 1843, first great success. Member of Kisfaluti Tarsasik in 1845. 100th play, Struency, presented in National Theatre in 1872. named director of National Theatre in 1873, whose activities he had guided since 1850s as stage manager, dramaturge, and secretary. Became a member of Patofi Tarsasik in 1876. A very prolific playwright. Plays extremely popular. He established plays about peasants as a dominant form on Hungarian stage for decades. A drama es Valfahe was the first handbook on dramatic theory in Hungarian. Important for guidance he gave to National Theatre. Also translated dramas from English, French, and German, the most notable being Goethe's Egmont and Shakespeare's Richard III and Comedy of Errors. Many of his plays remain unpublished, in manuscript prompt books in the National Zekanai Library. Zakat Katona has been translated into Romanian, Sigani, and Xikos into Finnish, Lilium Phi into Czech and Turkish, Anuralam into Croatian, and some of his poems into German. Zomori Deso. Born June 2, 1869 in Budapest, died November 30, 1944 in Budapest. Dramatist, novelist, short story writer, journalist. After completing gymnasium studies entered Academy of Music and became staff member of Nemzet, Pesti Naplo, and Pesti Hurlap. Went to Paris in 1890 to escape military service, and lived there until 1906 serving as correspondent for Hungarian newspapers. Became well acquainted with Alphonse Daudet. Visited London. Returned to Budapest in 1906, became journalist and served on staffs of Pesti Naplo and Az Ajasag for rest of his life. A Nagus Zoni presented by National Theatre in 1910. Died during Siege of Budapest. Writings of his last years are still unpublished. Noted for very individual style in dramas, novels, and short stories. Sought to express highly private world in manner unlike those of his contemporaries. Used rich, colorful, and original diction in portraying life in modern Budapest with strong pathos. Early dramas were influenced by Ibsen and French Impressionists. Some of his short stories have been translated into English, German, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. Timothy Aaron. Born September 20, 1897 in Farkas Lakot, died May 26, 1966 in Budapest. Novelist, short story writer, dramatist. Descendant of a family of agricultural workers. Completed studies in Catholic Gymnasium in Zakliad Varhely in 1917. Served on Italian front during World War I. Returned in 1919 to study law at University of Kolosvar and at Kereskedelmai Academia in Kolosvar, from which he obtained a diploma. Worked in a bank for a time. First story appeared in 1922 in Kaliti Ajasag. Lived in United States 1923 to 1926, mostly in New York, supporting himself by physical work. Returned to Kolosvar in 1926 and earned living as a journalist. Was affiliated with Helican, Korank, Erdei Fiatalok, and Velaz. Supported movements to improve the lot of common people and participated in work of populist writers. Attended Vaser Helai Talakozo, a meeting of progressive writers held by Romanian People's Front in October 1937. Twice awarded Baumgarten Prize. Associate member of Academy 1943 to 1949. Parliamentary representative 1945 to 1947. Awarded Kossuth Prize for Hazai Tukar in 1955. In 1954 became member of the National Council of Patriotic People's Front and in 1963 member of the Secretariat of the National Peace Council. Uses materials of Sikli people in Transylvania in his novels, short stories, and plays. Employs a mixture of realism and romanticism, natural and supernatural. Fiction is highly anecdotal, Diction highly poetic. Had strong humanistic feelings for the oppressed and was a constant supporter of the rights of man. Abel Orangetek has been translated into Dutch, French, German, Italian, and Polish, says Mariusz Kirillify into Czech and German, and some of his short stories into English, French, German, Italian, Polish, and Serbian. Tursinskijasi Gino. Born September 12, 1888 in Nagybanya, died June 11, 1969 in Budapest. Novelist, short story writer, and musician. Father was a mining official in relatively good financial circumstances. Was educated in local school. Abandoned desire to become painter, apprenticed as clerk and lawyer. First story appeared in Nugget in 1910, and from this time made living entirely from his writings. Enlisted in World War I, served on Russian and Italian fronts, and was discharged as second lieutenant in 1919. Views his entire life as an extension of happiness, freedom, and wandering of childhood and youth. Pursues music and music composition and painting as well as literary activity. Supported cause of workers and peasants between two world wars. Also earned living by playing guitar and flute in theaters, cabarets, and taverns. Lived the life of own characters. Found true literary form in 1920s in novelette, especially Kakak Marsi cycle. Experimented with drama near end of 1930s, and Cigányok, not published, was presented by Hungarian Theatre and National Theatre. Received Baumgarten Prize in 1929 and Kossuth Prize for Kakak Marsi cycle in 1949. Important figure in 20th century Hungarian prose fiction. Very prolific. His early novels and short stories were romantic, later more realistic. Protagonists are wanderers and bohemians. Strongly sympathetic toward those whose lives are without order and moral links. Characters follow purely private paths, often likened to John Steinbeck's hobo characters and attitudes. Made extensive contributions to children's literature. Translated some of Jack London's novels. E.g. Weiserosa Tortnet has been translated into German, Legenda Annual Paprika's role into Flemish and German, Missy Moku's Kalendje into French, and some of his short stories into English, French, German, Serbian, and Slovakian. Tenodi Sebastian. Born 1510? In Tinid, died January 31, 1556 in Sarvar. Minstrel. Parents were peasants. Probably attended Latin school in Pécs. Set sights on literary and music education. After suffering wound in course of continual wars in Transdanubian region, 1530 to 1535, he decided to become a scribe, then chose career of minstrel. Lived in Dombovar about 1538. Served at courts of Balin Turok, with whom he lived in Zajidvar until 1542, and, in 1544, of Imre attended parliamentary session in Nagasambat in 1544. Lived at court of Andras Bathory in Nyírbátor in 1548, thereafter on own estate in Kassa. Raised to noble rank by King Ferdinand in 1553. Went to Transylvania in 1553 to publish poems and visited Debrecen and Banaha. In Eger in 1555, where he died on estate of Thomas Nadasdy. The most important minstrel of his time. Developed many epic forms of 16th century. Composed melodies for his own poems. Main theme, Catholic and Protestant quarrels should be eliminated for confrontation of Turks. Wrote many historical songs and celebrated deeds of famous Hungarian soldiers. His poem Magyarország Szaratosa has been translated into Japanese. Tolne Lejos. Born January 31, 1837 in Gyorgy, died March 19, 1902 in Budapest. Novelist, short story writer, poet. Born Lejos Haji Masi. Son of a village clerk, family originally from Transylvania. Attended school in Gyöngy and Reformed Gymnasium in Nagykoros, where he studied under János Arany, QV. After completing studies at Reformed Theological College in Pest, taught Hungarian, Latin, and Greek languages at Reformed Gymnasium in Pest. His poems and prose writings began to appear in periodicals. Married Fanny Sugar in 1865. Became member of Kisfaludy Tarsasig in 1866. Moved to Murasvazerhely, Transylvania, in 1868 to become minister of Reformed Church. Founded Erdely in 1870 and Erdei Ficciello, a literary periodical, in 1879, which failed in 1880. Founded Kamini Zsigmond Tarsasig in 1876. In 1879 received honorary doctorate from University of Kolozsvár and became privat docent in Hungarian literary history at University of Budapest. Resigned from ministry in 1884 and moved to Budapest to earn living by writing. Efforts to sustain himself by this means were not successful. In 1887 founded Irodalom, which failed. Became teacher at one of higher elementary gymnasiums in Budapest in 1889, later its director. Became editor of Kepsk Szaladi Lapok in May 1891 for a time. One of the important figures in Hungarian prose near the end of the 19th century. Stands between Gyorgy and Mixuth, QQV, in development of the Hungarian novel. A follower of János Arany, QV, in poetry, but broke with romanticism of period in his novels and introduced strong social concerns. Novels show hatred for, and mercilessly satirize, Hungarians assimilating evils of capitalism. His picture of Hungarian society in 1860s and 1870s anticipates criticism and evaluations by 20th century writers of effects of capitalism on Hungarian people. He expected reform of society to be accomplished by changes in moral values. Translated English and French novels and prepared Hungarian textbooks. A collection of his short stories is available in Russian. Some of his short stories have been translated into German and Slovakian, and some of his poems into German. Tomorkenyi Istvan. Born December 21, 1866 in Skuld, died April 24, 1917 in Zjd. Short story writer and ethnologist. Family moved to Zjd in 1869. Attended schools in Zjd and Mako. Became apprentice pharmacist in 1882 for a time. First writings appeared in Zajidi Hiradu in 1884 under family name, Steingassner. Joined staff of Zajidi Hiradu in 1886, becoming acquainted with Gyorgy, QV. Conscripted into army in 1888 for 3 years and served in Bosnia, Zjd, and Vienna. Joined staff of Zajidi Naplo in 1891. Married Emikis in 1894. Collaborated with Kalman Mixuth, QV, on Orzagos Herlap in 1897. In 1899 became librarian of Samajai Library and employee of Verasi Museum, for which he undertook the collection of ethnographical materials and direction of excavations in the Zjd area. Named director of Verasi Museum in 1904. Wrote constantly until death from pneumonia. His short stories portray realistically the life and problems of peasants on isolated farms and of workers in the Zjd area. Early works dealt with peasants in romantic manner, but later ones turned to realistic portrayals of dramatic events in their lives. Writings also express humor of peasants stemming from their grim existence. Was especially effective in delineating their inner life. Also wrote important archaeological and ethnological studies and collected several thousand dialect words used in area of Zich. Some of his short stories have been translated into Bulgarian, French, German, Russian, and Serbian.